Right, sounds like we're recording. Thanks, Priyanka. The objective of Laser Focus is to explore critical topics in international development, research translation, and project management by providing an interactive forum for Laser Pulse Network members. We also would like to increase the awareness of Laser Pulse, as well as all of our projects' impacts, promote best practices, and just really encourage some greater community and interaction between all of our network members. Today, we will be hearing about some research that was carried out in 2020, particularly around barriers to collaboration between researchers and academics. The title of today's presentation will be Maximizing the Potential for Academic Practitioner Collaborations. And in addition to hearing a lot of the research from the researchers who are on the call today, we're also really looking for a lot of audience engagement and interaction. So we encourage you to continue writing in the chat if you have any questions or any comments. I think that will really optimize what everyone is able to get out of today's webinar. If you could please advance the slide. Great. I think most of us are probably familiar with Zoom at this point, but just as a reminder, if you could please keep yourself on mute. We invite you to pull up your video if your bandwidth and if your interest suits, then we would welcome to have as many faces as we can lighting up the screen. Please use the chat button for posting any questions or comments. And again, we really encourage participation. So if you really like something that somebody said, feel free to drop a little +1 or thumbs up. We really, again, want to create that community and create that interaction across all of our network members. And lastly, note that the session is recorded. So I would like to begin by introducing our research team. Everyone is from Purdue University, starting with Priyanka Brunes, who is the Scientific Research Manager at Laser Pulse, Min Lee, who is a PhD student in Industrial Engineering, and Besselbacher, who's a Senior Research Associate, Dr. Yuan Yi, who's a Professor in Industrial Engineering at Purdue, as well as the Academic Director of Laser Pulse, and Dr. Arvind Raman, who is a Professor in Mechanical Engineering and is the overall Director of the Laser Pulse program. We have also invited a few guest speakers. So there are participants across the audience that will be representing different perspectives, including Brent Wells from USAID, who will be sharing his perspective as a donor, John Hembling from Catholic Relief Services, sharing his NGO perspective, Stacy Preto from Catholic Relief Services, also sharing an NGO perspective, Ashima Krishna from the Purdue Policy Research Institute will be speaking as an academic, and Yuan Yi from Purdue University, also as an academic. And before we jump into the research or the findings or continue our conversation, we wanted to clarify also what we mean by academics and practitioners. We recognize that these aren't necessarily totally mutually exclusive identities, but when we say academics, we mean those scholars with advanced degrees who work at universities and are really involved in primarily research. We recognize that practitioners also generate evidence and are involved in research, but for today's presentation, we're drawing the line that researchers mean academic researchers. Practitioners are professionals that are engaged in the design, planning, or implementation of international development projects. They can include donors, government agencies, policymakers, NGOs, civil society, and or the private sector. We will begin, Brent, if I could call on you. As a representative of USAID, as we all know, is a major donor organization. Could you reflect a little bit, and maybe just a minute or two, what value have you observed in networks such as Laser Pulse that really bring together researchers and practitioners for these collaborations? Over to you, Brent.
Sure, thanks a lot. Happy to be here. Happy everyone to see you this morning, this afternoon. I think one of the very big benefits of these practitioner academic collaborations are that there is a demand for this type of expertise from donor and practitioner communities. And so it's really answering a need that we have in doing the work that we're trying to do, because a lot of that depends on best planning and research that will drive agendas in the places where we work, where problems are very sticky and demand sort of a multidisciplinary approach. Another thing that's amazing about these types of networks is that they're global and they're sector agnostic. So it's very important. We work across all sectors and all types of problems, and we work in all geographies. And so having partners in these networks, specifically academic partners that are on the ground in the locations where we work are important, because that can help to further drive the work that we're doing and help the decisions that we're making. You know, one of the nice things about the Laser Pulse network and how we work with them as USAID is that we have a co-creative process. So even when USAID and a donor might bring a problem to an academic and say, this is what we want to do, when there are local academics as part of that network team, it helps us to refine the question that we're asking, because then we have on the ground expertise and people that are familiar with the issue in the communities that we're trying to impact. And so I think that's really monumental to making sure that we get it right and to make sure we're asking the right questions. And then finally, I would just say that, you know, one of the major things that we're trying to do as a donor agency is to build sustainability in our programming and also to build capacity. And so academic practitioner or donor networks like this allow us to tie in with these local groups, build capacity in them. And then also it sort of sets up, you know, it is a network, but then as you work with people, you become closer to them and you have follow-on partnerships, and that capacity continues to grow, and sort of your how tightly you're knit as partners is also improved. And so then it just expands who we're able to work with and those close ties and who we know we can go to in those communities when we have recurring challenges that we'd like to address.
Great, thanks, Brent. And I think you've really underlined and highlighted a lot of the core components of Laser Pulse, that we recognize that research and evidence really aren't enough. You need that broader network and you need that connection with those that are on the ground. And it's not just a one-off collaboration, but it's something that can really endure. And particularly when there's a network, then you have a broader community that you can draw on for future collaborations as well. So thanks a lot for your perspective. Next slide, please. Yuen, I will hand it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Alex. I would just add to add on, in addition to some of the donors, one of the donors, Global Challenge Research Fund, also tap into a broader contemporary discourse around impact. And the logic is really to involve development practitioners and policymakers in the research process. And the logic, this is really sustained by a lot of significant literature. And this also sort of evolved the understanding of this type of collaboration. It's not just about a simplistic linear fashion, but more of very complex research ecosystems. And this involves many steps and many processes throughout the research cycle. So for those of you who have done this type of collaboration, we all know this type of work is quite difficult, quite often with a lot of challenges, but it's extremely rewarding when it works. So at Laser, we are extremely interested to embrace this deep collaboration between academics and development practitioner, policymaker, and donor. And our mission is this can result to deliver practical research-driven solution for global development challenges. So the main purpose of this survey and the study is really to better our understanding of the contributing factor and barrier to successful collaboration from a system engineering and process lens, so we can operationalize this kind of partnership process throughout our program design. Back to you, Alex.
Great. I just want to point out there's one question in the chat. We will hold off for a few more slides until we address the questions, but please keep them coming. Next slide, please. All right, it is time for our first poll, and this is for the whole audience, so we invite you to respond. Typically, have you participated in, or would you be willing to participate in these types of collaborations Would it be primarily to achieve better society through a shared vision built on sustainable partnership rather than just a one-off collaboration? Or would your primary motivation to be involved in a collaboration like this be more around obtaining skills and knowledge that might be useful for your work? And it's an either or. So if you could choose between these two options, what would be your primary motivation to participate in one of these researcher practitioner collaborations? And I'll leave it up for maybe just another 10 seconds or so. And Marcy, if you're able to share the results. So, what can you show them again really quick? That flashed by a little too fast for me to catch. Okay, thanks. So it looks like the vast majority of you are much more inspired by this first aim to achieve a better society through a shared vision. Interesting, about 84% of you, I don't know what our total response rate was, but the vast majority are much more motivated by this first objective. That sets us up, Priyanka, for your slide. Over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Sorry, I'm managing multiple things, so it took me a second, but that was very interesting. So I would like to kind of provide kind of the theoretical background for our study and this research that we've conducted. And as a lot of you, chose the option 1. So a lot of you have this, from the Sullivan and Skelcher optimistic perspective of these collaborations. You believe that there is a positive altruistic view of collaboration, and you believe in the greater good of collaboration to solve these problems. Now, it's not to say that there might be another perspective, which is around the resource dependency. And this goes to say that when we collaborate, there is a motive that we all have as well in terms of what we want to get out of it. And it kind of goes together. For this particular research and the theory that we really want to focus on is the realistic and the pragmatic perspective, and think about these type of collaborations as this evolving process that requires a lot of learning and adaptation. So it's not just about the optimistic or the pessimistic perspectives, but it's a combination of understanding these differences and how can both partners really learn and grow together. And so that's the theoretical perspective that we're kind of moving forward with here. With that, I'll kind of move into our research, our purpose and findings. So as you probably read when we sent the information out, the purpose of this research was to really understand what are some factors, what are some barriers that really impact these type of collaborations, what really, why people collaborate, what is the likelihood of these type of collaborations happening in the future, what experiences did people have in the past, etc. And so our two main kind of research questions really focused on what factors influence these collaborations, and then how likely are these things to happen again. As Brent mentioned earlier, a really important aspect of this is sustainability. And if part of this, if your experience is not as good, how do you then sustain it? So we really wanted to look at that, and we conducted an anonymous web survey back in 2020. This was sent out to a lot of different networks like LaserPulse as well. We got about 162 participants for the survey. As you can see, we had approximately pretty similar, about 89, 73 representations from academics and practitioners. And then we did conduct a lot of statistical analysis to see what kind of correlations we found among all of these different factors. So with that, I want to kind of do another fun thing in the chat. So one of the questions that we asked in our survey was how do you perceive research? How would you define research, perceive research in a word, in a sentence? And as you know, we got a lot of different answers, and we created word clouds for academics and practitioners. So if all of you in the chat could identify whether the left or the right, which one do you think is academic and which one do you think is practitioner? I think it'll be a fun exercise to see how this played out. So I'll give you guys like 10 seconds if you want to use the chat feature. So we have a few answers coming in. So a lot of you are saying that left is academic, right is practitioner. Someone said there's a blurred line between the two. Absolutely. Good observation. All right. So a lot of you were correct in terms of left being academics and right being practitioners. Now, as someone mentioned, there is a blurred line, right? There's also a lot of individuals who kind of bridge these two groups. Now, this was kind of the first thing that we realized when we were talking about research, even in our forums, that people understood research very differently. As you see, academics were very focused on developing new discoveries and new knowledge and innovation, while practitioners were really, the words that came out from them were around evidence, interventions, dissemination policy. So again, there is a little bit of difference in the way these two communities really perceive research. And so part of our discussion here also is how do we bridge this language, this gap, this perceptions around research, because both of these are valid, but how do we bring them together to make this experience better? So if you guys have any questions, please put them in the chat about this, but I'll kind of move on to kind of our next finding. So the next question we had asked was, what is the likelihood for all of our participants in the survey to participate in future collaborations? And as you can see, we found statistical significant differences between our responses from academics and practitioners. Our academic colleagues seem to have a higher likelihood to participate in these collaborations in the future than practitioners. And this was a really interesting result that we found. We didn't know what we were going to expect, but there is a little bit of difference. And so I kind of encourage you in the chat to reflect on whether your experience is similar to this, or what do you kind of think about this particular finding. With that, I'll kind of just switch to Alex for a second.
Sure, yeah. As you start to think about and reflect a little bit on the results that Priyanka has shared so far, I know we had at least one question in the chat that UN has partially answered. Let me scroll back up to the top. The question was, is there a particular area of focus or project in the laser pulse collaboration? And as UN indicated, we work in all USAID sectors and regions. So we really are open across the board for all potential topics and project areas. And I don't see any questions after that. There are a lot of comments about the word cloud, Priyanka, but just wanted to pause again and give you an opportunity. The slide, and could you maybe go back to the previous slide? Yeah, any thoughts on if this particular finding resonates with all of you, that academics are more likely to participate in future collaborations or potentially have a more positive perspective on how the collaboration went than practitioners? Well, maybe I can speak up even as a moderator, having worked for about 6 or 7 years now for an NGO, so more in the practitioner space. I think that oftentimes the supply, so to speak, of academics or the interest to collaborate on research is often much higher than those practitioners that feel like they have the time or the capacity to really engage in research. Since practitioners, we tend to kind of keep our eyes on the ground, so to speak. We're really involved in implementation. From my perspective and from what I've seen, research is often perceived as a nice to know or a nice to do, but not necessarily something that's really core and critical to the heart of what we do. I see a few other comments coming in. Let's see, 2 people have mentioned that it's similar to their experience, so it seems like it is resonating with you. And there's one question: how does the length of the partnership affect active participation? I wonder whether a long collaboration loses steam. Priyanka, any thoughts from you on that question?
Yeah, that I think is a really important question in terms of this. We started with this theoretical background about organizational learning, and part of the longer the relationship is about understanding each other's blind sides, understanding each other's the different realities of each other's worlds, and being able to figure out how do you work through that. And part of a lot of the collaborations that came out in the literature was these differences between short-term and long-term. And the idea is that the short-term project-based collaborations typically tend to have these issues because people haven't spent the time to really understand these differences. And so what we're hoping that, with this research, we can actually identify the areas where people can really spend time to have dialogue on, to be able to involve in that broader discussion on how can these collaborations be more sustainable over the future.
Great. And then there's one additional comment. I think academic researchers want to be involved in a broader view of problem-solving collaboration. Okay, back over to you, Priyanka, to continue with their.
All right. So I think that's Kristen's comment. I think it'll fit really well into our kind of next finding that we had, which was about which factors we found influenced future academic practitioner collaborations. So we designed the survey using the academic literature and really identified a lot of different factors. And so a part of it was, motivation to collaborate, the type of work conducted, and part of, I think, Kristen, your question, the type of work conducted combines with that length of, is it a short term, is it a one-time consultation kind of work versus are we here for a longer 2-3 year, long project. The other one was around, so this was a personal experience from our team, the gender composition of this team, level of involvement that practitioners have in the research process, relevance of the research outputs to practice, the institutional and professional barriers people face, frequency of past collaborations, so how experienced people are with this, and then the overall collaboration experience. And so when we ran the statistics on all of these things, all except the gender composition actually came back statistically significant. So that was interesting. We're still trying to figure out the gender composition in terms of like data, if why that didn't come out. But the rest of them definitely had, and then there was also correlations among some of these factors, specifically the level of involvement and the relevance of research outputs. And so we in the next kind of discussion, we really want to focus on the 3 that I've circled here in terms of the level of involvement of practitioners, specifically in the research process, relevance of research outputs to practice, and then the institutional and professional barriers faced. Do we want to pause for any questions, or should we keep going? I see that there is a few questions or comments, Alex.
I think there's just 1 or 2 comments. So Nor made the comment that academic institutions are stable organizations, so the academic researchers are able to continue multiple and longer collaborations. And Christopher Rice was in agreement with that comment.
All right. So as I mentioned, we looked into the research process. And so on the bottom of the graph, you'll see different research activities, all the way from development of research questions to dissemination of research outcomes. And then on our kind of, the vertical axis, it's the level of participation from practitioners. So the question that we asked all of the individuals who took our survey was, how did they perceive practitioners' involvement in each of these research activities. And as you can see, we've disaggregated our data analysis by gender in academics and in practitioners. And as you see, across all four demographic groups, dissemination and development of research products was a no-brainer that yes, practitioners are going to be more involved in that. However, where we found statistical differences was in the development of research questions and development of IRB. There was a pretty big difference. The other thing that you might notice, the other pattern you might notice here is that female practitioners, which is the green dot, if you can see that, has the lowest perception of how involved they are across the process. And then when we aggregated across all of the different activities overall as well, practitioner responses statistically were lower than academics for the involvement, their own involvement in the research process. So again, I want to kind of just pause here and see in the chat if there are any thoughts or just a quick kind of comments before I can move on to the next one. All right, so then I can kind of talk about the next thing, which is pretty, when you'll see it, it's pretty connected. What is the N for respective? I can get to that, Jennifer, in a minute. I can provide that information to you. So the next kind of thing that we looked at was the research outputs and whether they were relevant to practitioners when the collaboration ended, right? So that was the next question we had asked them. And again, so this is a box plot that was created, and you'll see the pattern as well is that female practitioner responses seem to be much less compared to the other groups. And so the point that we've been really, another correlation that we've really found out is this correlation between the involvement in the research process and connection with whether the outputs were relevant to practitioners at the end. And so that's a really important kind of theme that has come out of our research and it validates some of the work and our assumptions as we went in when Brent shared about, we were hoping that by these collaborations, we're developing solutions that are going to be usable. But if the researchers are not involved in the research process, then it is impacting the outputs. So with that, I can kind of go to a little bit of an engagement session with some of our NGO audience members.
Sure, I can pick up, Priyanka. I believe that John, you may be the only practitioner guest speaker. Stacy wasn't able to join, so this question is just for you. As a practitioner and representative of an NGO, how have these results resonated or maybe not resonated with your experience? And what would you recommend for involving practitioners, specifically women, to enable them to be more involved across the research process? So over to you, John.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Hembling. I work with Catholic Relief Services. I work in the research space, but alongside and very much in lockstep with our programming teams, particularly in health and social services. I do think the word cloud and the role that the word cloud resonates with me a lot. On the practitioner side, the idea of decision making and evidence needed for decision making in terms of what programming, what interventions to use, which are the best, which have the biggest impact, how can we advocate for and influence across our partners and across our government partners, our local NGO partners. How can we influence the use of those types of good practices and based off of the evidence is really important for us as an agency. And that's how I see most of our research being tied to those goals. In terms of the factors that influence future collaboration or future practitioner academic collaboration, that also really resonates with me. The idea that the level of involvement is tied to the relevance of the research itself and the findings seems very important. And then that third factor that was highlighted around institutional barriers and professional barriers, I think that may limit in some ways that level of involvement, which then impacts the potential relevance in different ways, probably on both sides of the practitioner academic collaboration. In terms of increasing this question in particular around increasing involvement, the gender point is really interesting. I found that data really fascinating. I would say I work primarily in public health. And so in public health, in my experience, you do find more women involved in the programming side compared to men. And in that way, I often see more maybe collaboration between when we do these research collaborations, there are women involved. So that it could be sector specific. It could be also who's involved with the research. For example, is kind of our more monitoring and evaluation programming staff more tightly connected to the research teams because there's some affinity there or technical connection. And maybe in the M&E world, it is more male dominated. So it could be these kind of structural issues about who's collaborating and who's involved, and then maybe even sector specific. I don't know if agriculture may be more male dominated than public health. And so you may have some of those kind of structural issues that we're seeing show up in the results. And in terms of recommendations, what we've found, or what I've been able to witness in terms of trying to involve more practitioners, is really creating the spaces for that, being very deliberate about planning, timing. This type of interaction takes time. It's not as easy as sitting on your computer and writing up a protocol. Which isn't easy by itself, but it's, if you are going to get voices, and many voices, including women's voices in this discussion, to make the results more relevant and useful in the end, and to strengthen these collaborations, you have to build in the time. And so we've, for example, facilitated pretty long processes of jointly defining research questions, jointly linking those questions to the types of variables or data that we would want to collect, identifying the best sources of data. So who are those populations? Again, from our practitioner teams really saying, actually, these people don't really know, these people do know, and so we should talk to them, down to then really thinking what are the most culturally appropriate methods to use, rather than just sticking with what we necessarily know. And so in that way, it's taken a long time, it takes a lot of investment, but that's the way I've found, at least, that we've been able to facilitate that and create the space for collaboration. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, John. I think you really shared a lot of wisdom, and I think that your deep experience, and for those of you that probably don't know John, he really is kind of an all-star around research at CRS. A lot of practitioners really enjoy working with it because he has such a diverse and deep understanding of research processes. But I would agree with you that some of this may be discipline specific, that there could be some trends just based on whether or not it's health versus agriculture versus nutrition. But I also want to underscore the point you brought up, that this isn't easy. It really does take a lot of effort and a lot of intentionality on both sides, a lot of investment to make these collaborations work. Priyanka, I don't know if you wanted to respond to anything that John said. There are a few questions and comments in the chat as well, but over to you for any responses.
I think I agree. I think from the data perspective, the survey was what had gone out to kind of all sectors. So when we did do the analysis, we had a representation across all of the USAID sectors that we had put in for. So it was sector agnostic. However, I do agree that certain sectors would probably have a higher, percentage of women who were much more collaborative than the others. So definitely. Alex, do you want to take any of the questions in the chat right now, and then we can?
Sure, yeah. Kristen had a question. She says she's been involved in collaborative research with schools around the US, and relationships with key school personnel were nurtured, with most schools designating a spokesperson to work directly with us. But then that person would leave his or her position and the collaboration suffers and is even potentially lost. Do you have any insight into that kind of situation?
Yeah, and to answer this question, I will also encourage Alex, you or Chris as our translation leads to think about, but from my perspective, this is very common. And even when we've worked with I'll say like Brent, the USAID offices as well, it's pretty common for turnover. And so how do we maintain those relationships over time? And from my personal experience, I think it's understanding, who else can be involved. So it's not a point failure, but trying to understand your stakeholders at large and identifying who you can establish those relationships with over time. But I'll kind of let Alex, you and Chris weigh in on this as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And what I've seen is it often helps if it rises to the level of the leadership and some sort of MOU or formal agreement can be put in place that creates a little bit of a barrier, that if those more personal connections are somehow lost for whatever reason, there is a more solid foundation for the collaboration and the partnership to continue. But certainly I would say designating a spokesperson, and as soon as that person would leave to replace them, that's really essential, because so much of this is that personal connection and that collaboration and trust and all of those things that really make good partnerships and really strong collaborations. And after one person moves on, there is a little bit of rebuilding that has to take place. But if you have the leadership at the higher levels and some sort of institutional agreement in place that can help at least in the transition to new point people or to a new partnership. And then Yuen just echoed that's interesting point. In her experience, having an advocate from both academics and practitioner groups is important. And any transition could help set back the progress, agreed. Tung made a comment that there's interest for collaboration in university in Vietnam around climate change. So do reach out if you're interested in potentially partnering around that topic. And let's see, Yuen, the responses we received from the survey have a good distribution across all sectors and gender. And then John just replied to Kristen, I agree, an advocate on both sides is critical. I find myself playing that role quite a bit. Yeah, I think I would agree with that. It's oftentimes the champions for research in the NGO world, and then the champions for NGOs or the practitioners in the university world are really critical. And then Yuen also replied to Tung that we had an RFA in Vietnam. Please do join our network so you're aware of other opportunities. Ashima responded, in my experience, having at least 2 team members from academic practitioner sides is helpful. That's another good idea. So then you wouldn't lose one if there's another one there, that it really helps with turnovers to have an easier transition. Great, thanks all for your comments and questions, and keep them coming. Back over to you, Priyanka.
Okay, so let's kind of move on to the third finding around barriers that we had. And so we, from the literature, we had identified a lot of different barriers. We categorized them as institutional barriers and professional barriers. And then professional barriers are basically what you would personally experience in the collaboration, your own professional growth. And from the data, again, as you see, we've disaggregated the data by gender and organization. And so here as well, when we did the statistical analysis, overall, we found that academics felt, the institutional barriers were much more challenging for academics as compared to practitioners. As you even see the other patterns in there, you'll again notice some different patterns where if you compare the academics themselves, you'll see that there is kind of a trend, the male academics versus the female academics. The male academics have reported higher barriers than female academics. And then if you look at the practitioners, you'll see that female practitioners have reported higher barriers than the male practitioners. So again, there is a little bit of trend in there, but this is where, again, the one thing that we found across everybody was the competing priorities and commitment, the time, and that was the barrier that came out to be the strongest for both. And this has been echoed by, I think, a lot of our speakers as well, that competing priorities is really difficult to manage in these type of collaborations. So with that, I think we can have another kind of discussion. Alex, if you want to take over.
Sure, yeah. So we started out hearing from the donor perspective. We heard also from the practitioner space. Now it's time to hear from the academics. So Yuen and Ashima, these are questions for the both of you. As an academic and representative of a higher educational institution, do these results resonate with your experiences? What are your what kind of partnerships or what kind of collaborations have you been in, and have you had similar restrictions or perceived inability to collaborate because of some institutional barriers? And what are your observations on how the barriers have impacted academics from participating in these collaborations? So over to you, Yuen and Ashima.
Ashima, do you want to start?
Sure, thanks, Yuen. Yeah, thank you for having me here. This is a really interesting discussion. I can speak to my experience as an architect and urban planner from the sort of perspective where it straddles both sort of more of a professional side and an academic side, which is why I found the comment earlier interesting that academic and practitioner role, some of those word clouds that you had, there is a significant overlap even in my experience. So one of the things that I think I have found very interesting in the academic role versus the professional or the practitioner role is, the effort that it takes to build trust in my perspective. So I do community development or community engaged work. So that trust building exercise is a long and very involved one, particularly because typically communities don't think of academics as being part of the community, right? They are the outsiders. And so there has to be an intentional and engaged process to build that trust, to then have that engaged academic or sort of collaboration to then have results in the community. So that process then becomes very important to create those to create those partnerships between academics and practitioners to facilitate that kind of a dialogue and trust building exercise with communities. And so to that end, in my perspective, partnerships between academics and practitioners are critical to facilitate that trust building exercise, because we are typically the outsiders. In my own experience in Buffalo, New York, for example, that was constantly something that I was engaging with while working on research projects, where it was critical for me to make sure that I am partnering with practitioners or representatives, community groups, right? And the appropriate ones, to make sure that I connect with the appropriate communities and have that relationship going, to be able to then have that engaged and sustained process. And so typically, in my experience, practitioners and academics do have complementary expertise that can really help each other, in this process. And then, of course, from an academic perspective, often, the question is, what are the barriers? There are so many barriers that you often work under, that then it's a great opportunity to have practitioners be part of that process, because they typically don't work in those sort of barriers. So then that collaborative process is really fruitful for the process. There can sometimes also be some misconceptions among those collaborations in terms of what each other wants to get out of that collaboration. And that can be sometimes problematic, as I have had in my experience. And so really sort of making sure right from the beginning, what are the expectations from each side, and making sure that the kind of sort of sometimes misconceptions of the outsider wanting to come in and imposing their perspective as the academic know-it-all, that really has to be one that has to be mitigated right from the beginning, because otherwise there is a lot of pushback, and that impacts both the practitioner and the academic, and then it has a long-term impact on the proposed project as well. So just some sort of initial thoughts just from my recent experiences in trying to create those kinds of collaborations. And then, of course, you know, the idea that they can be disrupted when there are turnovers. So my projects were disrupted when I moved to Indiana. And so those are incredibly challenging, and I still get communication from many of those practitioners to try and continue some of those works that I had started. And so it is definitely challenging to really have a more sustainable sort of longevity to a lot of these practitioner academic collaborations when there are those kinds of turnovers that can, you know, there are so many things that can impact that. In terms of institutional barriers, I'm trying to think, one of the biggest ones that I have faced is in terms of time. So academics often are pulled in so many different directions. There are so many different ways in which they are called on to do different things within the academic setting. So those kinds of sort of, you know, asks of time can be a huge, often barrier to really make sure that those kinds of collaborations, you know, are getting your full time and energy as they deserve. So that's been one of the biggest barriers that I had. Another one, of course, is all of the sort of, you know, things that can impact funding allocations within an institutional setting. So that can sometimes be a barrier in terms of how you can allocate some of those funding resources in that project that you are involved with. So those are some of the initial thoughts that come to mind. And I don't want to take too much of your time, so I'll give it over to you, A1. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashma. Just to add, thank you for a lot of the comments, and I resonate with. For specifically institutional barrier, I have observed several things in terms of scheduling, timeline. Academic usually work with a semester system or a quarterly system. So to be able to work with graduate students, and sometimes that does not necessarily in sync with what the NGO project that come along. It may start in the middle of the semester, you have a hard time to recruit students. So I see that actually is one of the challenges. And also if the project is too short, that not be able to support students for the full semester or full year, that also sort of putting the barrier for us to find a very good student to work on those projects. So there's a lot of course, strategy to mitigate that, but it is one of the issues that working with academics, the semesters system, sometimes it is coming to sort of the barrier to be able to recruit good student. Another thing that I also notice is when I work with this kind of project, things are being pivoting very quickly, especially working in a very difficult and challenging area. So there are many things have to evolve and change, and sometimes even a topic will be completely shifted and the focus of the research. So that type of sort of flexibility sometimes in the academic area, it's a little bit harder to pivot when you already hired a student and already have the postdoc hired, and their specialty may not fit your project that after pivot. So that's a sort of institutional barrier that I see that could have some setback. But I want to get back to the group because I know there's still some information will be good to share.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in the chat. Maybe we can loop back around at the very end because Priyanka, I want to make sure you can get through all of your results. We will have time, hopefully at the very end, for a little bit of Q&A. So back over to you, Priyanka, to wrap up.
Yuan, did you want to talk about this slide?
Yeah, actually, this is my slide. So this is actually summarize our sort of a quick takeaway of our survey study. We noticed that to be able to maximize this type of collaboration in terms of outcome and impact, it really has two different components that we need to pay attention to. And first is about more of understanding each other's, what are the benefits for all parties involved. And this really require a little bit more listening and flexibility to understand the timeline, expectations, what are the motivation, what people can get out of this kind of work, and also communicate clearly about each other's roles and responsibility and the expectation. So that kind of understanding will really help to facilitate this type of partnership. And also, very importantly, I think more for the academic side, is really have a full understanding of where this result will be used and how, and knowing your audience and how to plan this ahead of time. So the research really direct to answer those questions to support the program design or policy making, really knowing what will be relevant instead of working on the research alone without the input. So I think getting constant input, that's also another things I have learned that will help. The second component is about how do we, once we have the partnership started, how do we really make sure the process and the experience on both sides are very rewarding and productive? So this is, as I mentioned earlier, it's first of all, making sure our team are inclusive, really include all different voices and different input from all stakeholders and understand who are our stakeholders, and also knowing when to pivot and knowing where the realistic view in the field. So this is sort of the knowledge exchange and respect the practitioners. Their experience is a really great value to be able to understand the research question better, as well as having and conducted research that will produce relevant results. And those are very, very important piece. And lastly, I want to really point out the personal growth and learning process is continuous. As an academic researcher myself, and I have done a lot of this type of cross-sector collaboration, it really had to, I really had to be humble right from the start to the entire research process, because understanding other partners' expertise and the value be able to contribute equally. And I think that is critical. So I think all those is what we found in our survey. Back to you, Priyanka.
Great. I think then our very last question, and I would like to call again on Brent and John, as well as Ashuman Yuan. If you could just maybe share one recommendation on what you would suggest for your own sector, so academic practitioner or donor, what could they do to really maximize the benefit to all partners and improve the partnership experience? So to build off a lot of the things that Yuan was just sharing, what do you think that your specific sector could do to help foster some of these collaborations? And Brent, we can start again at the beginning. So if you have any thoughts from the donor perspective, over to you.
Sure, thanks. I think I think what Yuan has said about expectations is really important. Setting expectations from the beginning, it can help to mitigate a lot of sort of downstream missteps that might happen in a partnership. I also feel like making sure that a partnership is equally balanced on both sides, to make sure that both parties play an equal role in it, and that there's a mutual respect for what each party is bringing to the table. We at USAID, we're bringing the expertise of academics on because they have expertise that we don't have. And so, you know, we rely on them for, you know, the design of the project and telling us what sort of specifically we should be doing in terms of collecting data and analyzing it. And, you know, and then we have other expertise where it might come to convening parties or putting them in touch with the right people or having contacts with certain government organizations and stuff. And so sort of relying on us for making those connections is what they can benefit. So I think those are, you know, because the start of the partnership is oftentimes the most important, making sure that the expectations are in place and that there's this mutual respect for both parties. And then I feel like through collaboration after that, you can sort of, you know, get at anything that you want to get at.
Great. Yeah, I think those are all really good recommendations. Ashima entered in the chat humility and their willingness to learn from all involved partners. John, any last thoughts from you from practitioner perspective?
Just that I think, again, it boils down to, especially when we get to the actual data collection and the actual work of doing the research, really being clear, tying those expectations to realistic budgets, staffing. So often you get to the point where it just becomes, oh, this is not worth it, because especially the folks who are tied to our participants and tied to the data collection and tied to the communities that we're working in, they have full-time jobs because they're project staff and they're tied to something hard, you know, soft money that, and a project in particular. It's not like we have extra staff, and so they're doing double work. And in the end, the people who, you know, end up needing the data to use the data for the implementation say it's not worth it if that's not taken into account.
Great. And there are a lot of other really great comments in the chat. I know we only have 1 minute left. So Priyanka, I'll send it back to you to wrap up.
I'll take a quick second. So I just wanted to share with all of you in terms of how do we make this conversation move forward? How do we actually use this information in our own you know, work? And the idea is that, you know, we've taken all of these different things and put this in this framework, and we're hoping that we're come up with using this. We're working on actually developing like a workbook for everybody. So if you registered for this, you know, we'll send this workbook out in terms of how you can have dialogue. And I think like having these factors in hand as you're developing this will help you think about having those conversations with your partners to think about, okay, how, you know, what is the motivation? How do we get you more involved in the research activities? Have you had this experience in the past? If not, how can I support you? And so the idea is to really use this framework to acknowledge that there are differences, but then come together to have those dialogues and communication. I'll kind of just quickly, you know, I think Alex, if you want to just quickly talk about your team.
You can actually skip to the third slide.
Okay.
The summary. Great. So as many of you may know, as LaserPulse's research translation strategy lead, we have developed what we call the embedded research translation model. We really encourage you to check it out. Here are a few resources, capacity strengthening resources around collaborations, around working with researchers and practitioners, as well as research translation. First of all, there's our Introduction to ERT course. It's freely available on our website. Next month, we'll have Promising Practices for Embedded Research Translation, which pulls together not only recommendations on how to really maximize ERT, but also some resources to guide stakeholders through the process. And lastly, we have a researcher practitioner partnership toolkit, which very much speaks to the topic of today. It's an interactive web-based tool on different blind spots that we all bring to the collaboration, as well as discussion guides, really pointed questions, as well as resource materials. If you could switch to the very last slide. We thank you again for joining. Apologies, we went about 1 minute over. We do encourage you, if you have not already engaged through the network to sign up for our Laser Pulse network, as well as join our discussion groups, we can continue the conversation. And we encourage you to join us on April 28th for our next laser focused event. It's at 8 a.m. We will build on this discussion to work through gaps in research infrastructure, research translation, and sustainability mechanisms among higher education institutions across many of the countries where our partner Makerere University and RAN are working. So keep an eye on your inbox for that invitation and continue to stay involved in the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.